When a poor black woman was nearly evicted over a forged notice, no one expected her defense attorney to be a young stranger in cheap shoes. But that nobody was Jasmine Crockett, an undercover legal powerhouse. In just one hearing, she exposed a corrupt judge, a fraudulent landlord, and over 200 illegal evictions. What made her risk everything? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The courtroom was old, but its walls still held the scent of power. Worn wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators, most of them locals. Many familiar faces, some just curious. The ceiling fan above turned lazily, as if even it couldn't muster energy for what was supposed to be a routine eviction hearing. Judge Malcolm Warren took a seat with a heavy thud of authority, his robe swishing like the curtain of an old theater act he'd performed 1,000 times. He adjusted his glasses, already bored. At the plaintiff's table stood Howard Briggs, a smug attorney with silver hair and a sharper tongue, representing the landlord. Across the aisle sat Evelyn Turner, a weary, soft-spoken black woman clutching a worn leather purse, her eyes sunken from nights spent worrying about where she'd sleep next. Her alleged crime? Owing 2 months' rent, though she swore she'd paid every dime. The room buzzed with low whispers, as if justice had already made up its mind. Then the door creaked open. A young woman stepped in, petite, quiet, dressed in plain slacks and a faded blouse. No makeup, no designer handbag, just a black binder tucked beneath her arm and a quiet fire in her eyes. She didn't command attention. She absorbed it, like a storm cloud gathering energy in silence. She walked straight to Evelyn, bent down to whisper something, then stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, I'll be representing Miss Turner today." The room paused. Judge Warren arched a brow, amused. Briggs chuckled openly. "And you are?" he said, voice dripping with disbelief. "Her niece? Or did legal aid send the intern today?" Laughter rippled across the room, but the young woman didn't flinch. She simply looked at the judge and said, "You can call me Jasmine." Judge Warren leaned forward. "Miss Jasmine, this court requires proper representation. Are you qualified to—" "I'm not required to explain myself unless challenged under procedural grounds," she replied evenly, voice razor-sharp but calm. Briggs scoffed again. "Well, if this is how she's starting, we'll be home by lunch." He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a waste of court time." But something in the judge's eyes flickered. Uncertainty or curiosity, perhaps. Jasmine remained standing, unshaken. Her posture was perfect, her tone measured, but her eyes, they had seen battles. She didn't come to play defense. She came to dismantle. What they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was who she really was, Jasmine Crockett, the Jasmine Crockett. A legal prodigy once dubbed the iron voice of the people by national press. She had made her name defending the forgotten, the exploited, the abandoned, and winning. But 3 years ago, she disappeared from public view, rejecting offers from big firms and networks. Rumors said she burned out. Truth was, she'd grown tired of grand stages where the real fight never reached. So she came here, to towns like this. Places where the system choked the poor slowly and no one noticed. Today wasn't a case for her. It was a reckoning. She had dressed down not because she had to, but because she wanted to be underestimated. She wanted to feel the full weight of bias, to expose how deep it ran. She wanted Warren and Briggs to dismiss her, to smirk, to laugh, because that was the only way she could rip their facade apart, piece by piece, with their own arrogance as the stage. Jasmine didn't bring theatrics. She brought truth. But truth doesn't roar when it walks in. It waits, and when it speaks, it breaks everything. And just like that, the performance began. Briggs rose from his seat with theatrical ease, brushing a non-existent speck from his tailored lapel. "Since we're apparently entertaining community reps today," he began, voice thick with derision, "perhaps we should start with the basics." He held up a leather-bound volume of state statutes like a relic from a holy order. "Per Mississippi Tenant Statute, Section 42B," he declared, turning to face the gallery, "a landlord may initiate eviction if rent is unpaid for more than 30 consecutive days." Ms. Turner, according to financial records provided and verified, has failed to pay rent for not 1, but 2 months. He paced slowly, deliberately, like a lion sizing up prey. It's not personal, he said, though the smile on his face told another story. It's just the law. He turned toward Jasmine with a smug glance. Perhaps your binder doesn't include that section? Jasmine didn't move. She didn't flinch. But the tension in the room coiled tighter, like a storm gathering force in silence. Briggs wasn't done. Let's go further, Your Honor, he said, flipping another page with a crisp snap. Section 42, B.7, subclause C states that any delay in payment, even with partial deposits, entitles the landlord to reclaim possession, regardless of intent to pay. He let the words hang in the air like a noose. This isn't a moral issue. It's a contractual one. Ms. Turner signed a lease. She broke it. End of discussion. Judge Warren nodded slowly, lips pressed together in restrained approval. He looked to Jasmine, who remained still, calm on the outside but burning beneath. The entire room could feel it. She was surrounded, not by men, but by walls built from words, sharpened into weapons, aimed at someone the system never thought would fire back. And Briggs knew exactly what he was doing. He spoke quickly, forcefully, throwing out citations like bullets in a gunfight, hoping one would hit. The court has ruled in Morgan v. Dawson, 1994, that non-payment constitutes default, regardless of hardship. He turned a page. In Henderson Properties v. Clay, the appellate court held that equity has no place when the facts are clear. He looked at Jasmine like a man tossing a match onto dry grass. So I ask again, is this a legal argument or a dramatic plea for sympathy? Several people in the gallery nodded along. Some whispered. Jasmine could feel it, the doubt creeping in. Not hers, but theirs. The courtroom wasn't just judging her evidence. It was judging her right to even be here, to speak, to defy. But Jasmine Crockett didn't come to ask for space. She came to take it back. But just as Jasmine opened her mouth to speak, just as the room leaned in to finally hear her side, he cut her off. Ms. Jasmine, Judge Warren snapped, raising a hand like a school principal disciplining a noisy student. His voice cracked across the courtroom like a whip. Let's not waste the court's time with irrelevant commentary. This isn't a protest rally. Jasmine froze, not out of fear, but calculation. Her expression didn't change, but her spine straightened like steel pulling itself upright. Warren didn't stop. I'm giving you the courtesy of standing here today, but this court requires legal facts, not emotion, not posturing. A murmur rippled across the gallery. Briggs leaned back, arms folded, lips curled into a smile that screamed, checkmate. It wasn't just dismissal, it was domination. And it wasn't about her argument, it was about her presence. The courtroom fell silent, but the silence was not peace, it was suppression. Jasmine looked up at Warren, eyes sharp and unwavering. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't stepped out of line. She had followed every rule, filed every paper, and stood where she was allowed to stand. Yet still, she was being swatted down like a child speaking out of turn. It was a message dressed as decorum. You don't belong here. Her client, Evelyn, shrank in her seat, hands trembling in her lap. Jasmine saw it, felt it, how power suffocated people without ever shouting. And that was the game. Silence the voice before it starts. Strip the fire out of it with protocol. Make resistance look like disruption. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fall into their trap. Instead, she exhaled slowly, reached into her binder, and pulled out a single sheet of paper with the kind of quiet finality that sent a chill through the courtroom. Your Honor, she said, stepping forward with calm precision, before this court continues to entertain Mr. Briggs's interpretation of legal precedent, I believe we need to first determine if this case has any standing at all. The room stilled again. Even the gallery, previously full of smirks and low laughter, grew still, as if bracing for something they didn't expect. This, she continued, holding up the eviction notice with gloved fingers, is the document at the center of these proceedings. It claims Ms. Turner is to be evicted due to non-payment. and is signed, so it appears, by a notary named Martha Jean Holloway. She walked the document over to the clerk's desk, then looked directly at Judge Warren. "But there's a problem, Your Honor," she said, steady and clear. "Martha Jean Holloway passed away on April 3rd, 3 years ago." She reached back into her binder, producing the official state death certificate, along with public registry screenshots confirming the notary license had been closed and inactive since 2021. No active notary, no legal notice. That makes the entire eviction order invalid under Section 48, subsection A of Mississippi housing law. Her voice never rose. She didn't dramatize the moment. She let the truth speak, cold and bare. Briggs froze, caught mid-reach for his pen, his confident smirk draining into something tight and uneasy. Even Judge Warren shifted in his seat, clearing his throat louder than necessary. But Jasmine wasn't done. Not by a long shot. She turned the page in her binder and held up a second stack of documents, organized, labeled, bulletproof. "This is where the story begins to rot," she said. "Upon investigating the source of Miss Turner's rental payment records, I found significant inconsistencies between deposits received by the landlord and the business filings reported to the state." She approached the projector screen and, with the click of a remote, displayed a series of highlighted spreadsheets and tax forms. In the second quarter of last fiscal year, 3 full months of reported rental income disappeared from Turner Properties LLC's filings. She flipped to the next screen. But that same income reappears in a newly formed entity, Larkhill Services LLC, registered in Delaware to avoid local transparency requirements, and owned by the same man, Daniel Green. She paused. "The plaintiff." One man in the gallery leaned forward, brow furrowed. Evelyn Turner clasped her hands to her mouth in disbelief. Briggs was now visibly sweating, his temple beating under the courtroom lights. He adjusted his tie. Searched for something, anything, in his notes, but he looked like a man reading instructions in a language he no longer understood. Jasmine stood completely still, eyes forward, voice calm. "What this suggests is intentional obfuscation of income to evade taxes and conceal available funds, likely to fabricate a case for non-payment when no such deficiency existed." She let the accusation land without blinking. In short, the plaintiff manufactured a narrative, forged a notarization, and brought it before this court to illegally dispossess a woman of her home. It was no longer a courtroom, it was a powder keg. Judge Warren stared at the documents now spread before him like landmines. He looked cornered, like a man realizing too late that the floor beneath him had shifted. He tapped his gavel once, not to restore order, but because he didn't know what else to do. "Ms. Jasmine," he said, voice noticeably quieter, "you are accusing the plaintiff of perjury and financial fraud?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. "I am not accusing, Your Honor," she replied. "The documents accuse. I'm merely giving them a voice." It was surgical, not loud, not theatrical, just undeniable. For the first time, Warren didn't speak. Briggs didn't move. The gallery didn't whisper. Everyone was frozen, not out of fear, but revelation. Jasmine had turned a courtroom that mocked her into a room that feared her. Judge Warren leaned back in his chair, visibly uncomfortable, his fingers tapping the gavel like it might offer him a way out. The room had shifted. The gallery, once noisy with doubt and low chuckles, now sat stiff and quiet. Jasmine's evidence had cut deeper than expected. The forged notary, the shell companies, the paper trail that led straight to the plaintiff's front door. And yet, as the power in the room began to tilt away from him, the judge did what he had always done when cornered. He reached for procedure. "This court," he said, his voice overly formal, "acknowledges that the evidence provided by Ms. Turner's representative presents potential discrepancies. However, given that no formal motion has been submitted to request evidentiary hearing and without a sworn deposition or cross-examination of the notary's records, the court is limited in what it may consider today." His words were fast, mechanical. He wasn't speaking to Jasmine. He was speaking to the wall behind her, hoping it might swallow his responsibility. "Accordingly, I will dismiss the eviction without prejudice and recommend that both parties seek appropriate civil recourse if desired. This hearing is now—" "Your Honor," Jasmine said, interrupting without raising her voice. "One last statement, for the record." The gavel froze midair. A second passed. Then two. Warren's eyes narrowed slightly. You're not counsel of record. Your standing here is already exceptional. This court doesn't make a habit of giving the floor to— I won't take the court's time, Jasmine replied, her voice calm, unwavering. But what I will say, what I must say, is not for me. It's for every person in this room who's ever been dismissed without being heard. Her tone didn't plead, it pressed. Warren studied her for a long moment, as if calculating the political risk of letting her speak one more sentence. Then, with the smallest nod, he lowered the gavel, but not in dismissal. The room held its breath. Jasmine stepped to the center of the courtroom. She didn't walk quickly. She didn't project theatrics. But there was something in the air around her that made people lean forward, as though they knew something was about to change, even if they didn't know what. She stopped, facing the judge directly, then slowly turned toward the gallery. My name, she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, is Jasmine Crockett. There was a pause. At first, the name meant little to some, but not to all. From the second row, a woman gasped and whispered, "That can't be." A man 3 rows behind her mouthed the name again, brows raised. Even Briggs, who had begun stacking his files with smug dismissal, looked up sharply. Jasmine let the silence build, not out of pride but precision. For 15 years, she continued, her voice steady, I have served as legal counsel for families crushed by systems that pretend to be blind, but somehow always seem to favor the powerful. I've advised legislative committees on housing rights reform. I've defended victims of redlining, gentrification, and predatory lending practices. I've stood before appellate judges and walked into federal buildings filled with men who didn't believe a black woman from the South could know more than they did. Now, she turned back to Warren, locking eyes. But today, I came here as a community representative. I didn't flash credentials. I didn't demand special treatment. I came dressed like the people I serve, and I stood in line like everyone else. She took a breath. And what did this courtroom do? It laughed. It mocked. It tried to erase my voice before I ever opened my mouth. She wasn't angry. She was surgical. I let it happen, not because I didn't know how to stop it, but because I wanted everyone here to see exactly how easy it is to discredit someone who looks like me. How fast a woman defending her neighbor becomes a nuisance. How quickly truth becomes inconvenient when it threatens comfort. She took a step forward, not toward the bench, but toward the people. I'm not here to be a headline. I'm not here for applause. I came because Ms. Turner, like so many others, was being erased with paperwork, evicted not just from her home, but from the dignity of being heard. I came because this courtroom forgot something, that justice doesn't require wealth or a title or $1,000 retainer. It requires courage and truth. There was no movement in the room now. Even the court reporter had paused, forgetting to type. The law, Jasmine said, her voice calm but heavier now, is not the property of the privileged. It is the promise to the powerless. It belongs to the mother with 2 jobs and no lawyer, to the senior who doesn't know how to read fine print, to the family fighting a system that counts on their silence. She stopped, let it hang, and then, I didn't come here for recognition. I came here to remind this courtroom, and every courtroom like it, that you don't need a badge to tell the truth, and you don't need permission to demand justice. Judge Warren sat motionless, his fingers frozen above his paperwork. His face was unreadable, but his posture had changed. His authority rattled. Briggs said nothing, eyes locked on Jasmine like a man watching a chessboard collapse. Evelyn Turner had tears in her eyes, not of fear but relief, vindication. She was no longer invisible, and around them all the room exhaled, not just in surprise but in shame, quiet, unspoken shame, because they had seen what power should look like, and it didn't wear a robe or a tailored suit. It wore courage. The silence after Jasmine's statement hung heavy, but she wasn't finished. Not yet. She stepped back toward the center of the room, her binder still tucked under her arm like a weapon yet to be unsheathed. And if the court will allow, she continued, voice calm but cutting, I'd like to submit one final exhibit, something I discovered during my preparation for this case, though it extends well beyond Ms. Turner's eviction. She opened her binder slowly, methodically, then pulled out a thick folder sealed in a plastic sleeve. "This," she said, handing it to the clerk, "is a record of campaign contributions made to the judicial campaign of one Judge Malcolm Warren over the last 6 years. Specifically, contributions made by Turner Properties LLC, Larkhill Services LLC, and 6 other landlord-owned entities, all registered under a shared parent company." The gallery stirred. This wasn't just law anymore. This was corruption. "Each entity donated just under the reporting threshold," Jasmine continued, "which taken individually seems legal. But when viewed as a collective across shell corporations, it paints a very different picture." Judge Warren's face paled, his jaw tightening as if he'd bitten down on something sour. Jasmine turned slightly, eyes scanning the room. "Now, what makes this more than coincidence," she said, pacing slowly, "is that in the last 4 years alone, Judge Warren has presided over 36 eviction cases involving these same property groups." She held up a stack of printed court dockets. 36. And in every single case, the ruling favored the landlord, without exception. Her tone wasn't loud. It was lethal. "No delays granted. No continuances approved. Not one case referred to mediation." She stepped closer to the bench, eyes locked on the judge. "That's not law, Your Honor. That's a pattern. And patterns, especially those tied to campaign money, demand accountability." Briggs shifted uneasily in his seat, his face tight with panic, thinly veiled behind professionalism. She paused just long enough for the weight of her words to settle in like concrete. "This isn't just about one forged eviction notice," she continued. "This isn't just about Ms. Turner being targeted." Jasmine gestured to the gallery, to the people watching with wide, frozen eyes. "This is about dozens of families who were pushed out of their homes, many without legal counsel, some without even being present, because the system wasn't built to hear them. It was built to move them." Her words sliced through the room like a scalpel. "And the more we dig, the more this looks less like a courtroom and more like a machine, a well-oiled legal mechanism engineered to funnel power upward and silence those who resist." Judge Warren leaned back in his chair, but there was no hiding the sweat beading along his brow. The mask of authority was cracking, slowly, visibly. "This," Jasmine said, holding up the final folder, "is a preliminary report compiled from court archives, campaign finance records, and state business filings. I've sent copies to the state attorney's office, the Judicial Ethics Commission, and the Bar Association." A few audible gasps echoed across the gallery. "And now," she said, placing the folder on the clerk's table with deliberate finality, "this courtroom is on the record. Whatever happens next, this doesn't stay buried." The walls seemed to close in around Judge Warren. The once controlled atmosphere of the courtroom had unraveled into something raw, exposed, and electrified. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just defended a tenant, she detonated a legal conspiracy with a stack of papers and a calm voice. And the judge who once mocked her now sat at the center of a web the whole room could see. The room was on the edge of something, tilting, trembling, seconds from collapse. But Jasmine didn't let it fall quietly. She drew a breath, calm and controlled, then stepped forward again, voice unwavering. "Given the evidence presented here today, and the apparent conflict of interest now seated behind the bench," she said, eyes locking with Judge Warren's, "I am formally requesting that this case be transferred to the jurisdiction of the Mississippi Bureau of Judicial Conduct and the State Attorney General's office." The words weren't a plea, they were a trigger. This court cannot investigate itself, not when the judge overseeing the case is tied, financially and procedurally, to the same network responsible for the abuse. Warren opened his mouth to interrupt, but Jasmine didn't let him. "With all due respect, Your Honor, you are no longer in a position to rule on this matter. Not with credibility, not with integrity." Gasps rippled through the room. You could feel the tide shift in real time. "The plaintiff committed fraud," Jasmine continued. "But if this courtroom allows that fraud to go unpunished, if it buries this file, closes this case quietly, then it becomes a participant in the crime." She turned toward the clerk, placing a signed motion and full report on the table. "This is a written request for state-level review under Mississippi Code, Section 9-4-23. It outlines the connection between Turner Properties LLC, the judge's campaign finance reports, and 36 prior cases of potential judicial bias. Her hands were steady, but her words hit like a hammer. This isn't just an ethics violation, it's institutional misconduct, and I refuse to let it be treated like anything less. The gallery exploded, not in volume, but in energy. People leaned forward. They whispered names. They repeated numbers. A woman in the third row wiped tears from her eyes, but they weren't from sadness. They were from something else. Vindication. Jasmine had done what no one thought possible. She had turned the courthouse upside down, and she wasn't done shaking. Judge Warren leaned forward slowly, like a man walking out onto thin ice. "Ms. Crockett," he said, his voice dry, cautious, "you are accusing a sitting judge of corruption in open court. That's a serious charge." "I'm not accusing," she replied, never blinking. "I'm submitting evidence. The charges are for someone else to decide." She turned toward the gallery now, speaking not just to the judge, but to every witness in the room. "Let the system be tested. Let the process work for once. Not against us. But that can only happen if it's moved out of this room and into the hands of those who don't have something to lose." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. Everyone, Warren, Briggs, the clerk, the bailiff, felt it. Jasmine had taken control, not just of the narrative, not just of the courtroom, but of the very machinery they thought only they could touch. The first crack in the silence wasn't loud, but it was deep. A soft, wet gasp came from the back row, almost too quiet to notice. An older woman with short gray curls clutched a wrinkled tissue in one hand, her other hand gripping the armrest as if it anchored her to the room. Her lips trembled, but no words came, only tears, steady and unrelenting. For years, she had sat in that very courtroom as a spectator, watching others fall to rulings she didn't understand. She thought the law was simply a language she never learned. Now, for the first time, she realized it was a weapon aimed at people like her. She looked at Jasmine, and in her expression was something between gratitude and grief. Next to her, a young woman, maybe her daughter, rubbed her shoulder but stared straight ahead, frozen as if holding back a storm she had buried for too long. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't have to. The truth was doing the talking now. Then the dam broke. A man, mid-60s, wearing a work-stained flannel shirt and jeans, rose slowly from the third row. He wasn't loud. He didn't gesture wildly, but his voice carried like it had been waiting years to be heard. "I was evicted in this very room 10 years ago," he said, eyes fixed on Judge Warren. "Notice came in the mail, signed by a notary. Said I owed $300. He paused, swallowed. "But I paid it. I had the receipt in my hand when I showed up. Judge didn't even let me speak. Said it was already decided. Told me to leave." A hush fell again. His voice cracked. "I slept in my truck for 2 weeks. My wife left the year after." He didn't cry. He just stood there, fists clenched, broken in a way only time could explain. And then, one by one, they started standing. A woman 3 rows back. "They evicted my mother the day after her cancer surgery. No warning." A teenage boy holding his grandmother's hand. "They said she signed something, but she can't even read." A construction worker in steel-toed boots. "Same notary, same stamp." "My lease was still valid." A mother in scrubs. "I had proof of payment." They wouldn't even look at it. The air inside the courtroom changed. It became heavier, but not oppressive. It became alive, with voices, with memory, with rage. Jasmine stood tall in the center, eyes wide but not surprised. This was never just about Ms. Turner. It was never just about this one ruling. This courtroom was a crime scene dressed in tradition, and now the victims were lining up to speak. Judge Warren gripped the edges of the bench, watching as his courtroom turned against him. Not in chaos, but in clarity. His face lost all color. This was no longer a hearing. It was an exposure. Every nod, every tear, every whispered "me too" was a brick crashing through the walls he had built around his authority. People pulled out manila folders, folded letters, emails printed in blurry black and white. One man held up a yellowed eviction notice, shaking in his hand. "Same company," he said. "Same language. Same judge." A woman turned to the person beside her, whispering, "We thought we were just unlucky." Another said, "They told me I didn't have a case, but I never knew about the money, about the connections." The tension wasn't chaotic, it was unified. A low, rolling thunder of revelation passing from person to person, row to row, connecting lives that had once believed they suffered alone. For so long, this courtroom had been a place where voices were cut short, where silence was a requirement for survival. But not anymore. Jasmine stepped back, allowing the energy to build. Her eyes scanned the gallery, people who had walked in as strangers but were now united by shared injustice. A collective truth had surfaced, and no one, not even a judge with decades on the bench, could bury it again. Judge Warren tried to speak. His mouth opened, but his voice failed him. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't drown beneath the wave rising inside the room. And in that moment, for the first time, he looked small, not just in stature, but in power, because now the room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to them. It didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. The polished oak, the elevated bench, the weight of centuries of legal formality, it was all still there. But something beneath it had shifted. The air was thicker, still, not with fear but with gravity, with consequence. For once, the cold machinery of law had stalled, not to punish the powerless, but to face itself in the mirror. Judge Warren leaned forward, his voice no longer carrying authority, only obligation. "The eviction order is vacated, effective immediately." The words didn't echo. They landed, heavy, irrevocable. Evelyn Turner's shoulders dropped, as if something enormous had finally slid off her back. She blinked fast, her breath catching, her fingers trembling in her lap like leaves in wind. Jasmine placed a hand gently on her shoulder, solid, steady, anchoring her in the reality of this moment. A moment that had taken everything to reach. But the judge wasn't done. "In addition," he said, each word dragging behind the last like a weight chained to his conscience, "this court formally refers all evidence submitted today, including documents detailing forged notarization, falsified financials, and irregular eviction rulings, to the Office of the Attorney General of the State of Mississippi." The gallery froze. No murmurs this time, no whispers, just a collective inhale as the courtroom grasped the full scale of what had just happened. A local judge had referred himself to the state for investigation. "Furthermore," he added, clearing his throat, "this matter is also being submitted to the Judicial Ethics Commission for immediate review. All eviction cases previously ruled on by this court involving Turner Properties LLC and its affiliates will be subject to reevaluation." It was an earthquake wrapped in legal language, and still, no one moved. Then Evelyn let out a sound, half laugh, half sob, that seemed to slice through the tension like sunlight through fog. Her hand covered her mouth. Her chest shook as tears streamed freely down her cheeks. She wasn't crying because she had won. She was crying because she hadn't been erased. Her home, her dignity, her right to simply exist without fear was finally recognized. She turned toward Jasmine with the kind of expression people only wear when they've seen justice for the first time in their life. Jasmine didn't say a word. She just nodded. Judge Warren spoke again, but now his voice was softer. "Ms. Turner will remain in her home under full legal protection during the course of these investigations. All outstanding rent claims are hereby dismissed." He adjusted the papers in front of him, but his hands weren't as steady as they had been hours earlier. Given the undue stress and emotional damage caused by this fraudulent eviction process, this court also recommends mediation proceedings for restitution, the exact sum to be determined by a neutral arbitrator. This time the silence was a different kind of heavy, not with tension, but with release. In the back row, someone whispered, "It's really happening." Another voice, quiet and awed, added, "They're finally listening." People began nodding, not to one another, but to themselves, like they were remembering their own eviction letters, their own court dates, their own silencing. Jasmine turned slowly to face the room. Her eyes scanned the faces, not for approval, but for awareness. She had seen too many courtrooms, too many men like Briggs, too many benches like Warren's. She knew this victory wasn't the end, but it was a shift, a breach in the wall. Briggs sat hunched, lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. His knuckles were white, his pen unmoving. His entire posture was collapsed, not out of exhaustion, but defeat. He didn't even try to argue, didn't protest, didn't reach for one last technicality to hide behind, because there were none left. The law he had twisted for so long had finally turned back on him. As the final words settled, Judge Warren set down his pen, slowly, deliberately. The same hand that had signed dozens, perhaps hundreds of rushed eviction orders now hung useless at his side. His eyes met Jasmine's one last time. There was no defiance left, no superiority, only a quiet, exhausted resignation. And in that look, Jasmine saw what she had come for. Not revenge, not applause, but the crack. The undeniable fracture in the facade of invincibility this system had always worn. She had forced it to flinch. Evelyn stood up slowly, as if still testing whether her legs would carry her through this new reality. The clerk approached and handed her a signed order of dismissal. Her hands shook as she accepted it. She stared at it like it was more than a piece of paper. Because it was. It was a return, a resurrection, a validation of all the days she thought the world had stopped seeing her. And then she did something no one expected. She reached into her worn purse, pulled out the crumpled eviction notice, the very one that had nearly cost her everything, and held it up. Then without a word, she tore it clean down the middle. The room didn't erupt. It didn't have to. This was not a moment for noise. It was a moment for truth. The courthouse behind them had fallen silent. No more objections. No more gavel strikes. No more men in suits playing gods with paper and signatures. Just sunlight stretching over cracked pavement and the hum of distant traffic moving on, unaware that history had just shifted inside that aging brick building. Jasmine walked quietly down the courthouse steps, her binder still tucked under one arm, her pace unhurried. The press swarmed in a half circle at the base of the stairs like bees around a fire. Flashes sparked. Microphones were shoved in her path. A woman with a network badge barked a question too fast to understand. "Ms. Crockett, how long have you known about the judge's connections?" Another voice rose behind it. "Will there be criminal charges?" One shouted over the others. "Do you plan to sue the court itself?" But Jasmine didn't stop. Her eyes never flinched, never darted toward the cameras. She walked straight through the chaos as if none of it touched her, like a ghost passing through noise. The reporters faltered. Their voices dropped. They watched her go, realizing too late that this wasn't a woman chasing spotlight. This was a woman who had already been in the dark and learned how to light her own fire. Evelyn followed behind her slowly, still holding the crumpled court papers that had once felt like a death sentence. She looked around at the reporters, then at the courthouse. For so long, she thought this place was final. That once you walked in, whatever it handed you, you just had to take. But today, she had walked out not just with her home, but with herself. They turned a corner, away from the cameras. The noise fell behind them. The late sun warmed the sidewalk in wide golden streaks. Jasmine stopped near the edge of a parking lot, the courthouse now just a shadow behind her. She took a deep breath, not heavy, not tired, just present, like someone finally standing in clean air after years of smoke. And that's when Evelyn spoke, voice soft but shaken. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you help me?" Jasmine didn't turn right away. She looked down the street first, where the sun was dipping behind rooftops and casting long, sharp silhouettes across the asphalt. Then she looked over her shoulder at Evelyn, her eyes calm but ancient in a way only experience can make them. "Because I've been where you are," she said plainly. The words weren't rehearsed. They came from a place too deep for performance. "I've felt the floor drop beneath my feet with no one there to catch me. I've watched my mother beg a landlord for one more week. I've seen men in courtrooms call her ma'am while quietly stealing everything she had left." Her voice tightened, but only slightly. The law didn't care. The papers didn't care. And for years, I thought maybe that was just how things were, that we were meant to lose. She paused, watching Evelyn absorb it. The older woman's eyes were brimming again. But it wasn't grief anymore. It was something closer to awakening. "But then," Jasmine continued. I learned the law isn't magic. It's a tool, and it's been used against people like us for too long. So I decided I'd learn to wield it better than anyone. Not for trophies, not for claps, but because no one else was coming. Evelyn nodded slowly, a hand tightening on the strap of her purse. And today, Jasmine said, her voice dropping to a whisper, wasn't about saving you. It was about ending the lie that says people like you are alone. Jasmine turned back toward the horizon. The streets were empty. The world was quiet again. And in that golden, fleeting silence, Jasmine took one last breath and stepped forward. Not toward applause, not toward interviews, but toward the next unseen battle. She didn't need a parade. She didn't need anyone to remember her name, because she hadn't come to be remembered. She came to make sure someone else didn't get forgotten. And as her silhouette stretched into the fading light, Evelyn stood alone for a moment, watching the woman who had walked into her life like a storm and left like a prayer. The camera would fade to her retreating figure, backlit by the orange haze of sundown, each step disappearing into the glow. Then over that image, the narration would begin, not Jasmine's voice, but something older, wiser, like truth speaking to the audience directly. Some people don't need a headline, or a statue, or their face on a billboard. Some people carry justice in their bones, and all they need is a courtroom brave enough to listen. They don't come to be honored. They come to make sure someone else gets a fighting chance. And then quietly, they disappear, back into the fire, fade to black. It didn't take long for the story to ripple. By sunrise the next day, the courtroom that had stood for decades as an unshakable symbol of local power was the center of something else entirely. Scrutiny. The first report was a grainy clip posted online. 26 seconds of shaky cell phone footage showing Judge Warren's voice breaking as he vacated the eviction and ordered a full investigation. No production, no graphics, just raw silence interrupted only by gasps and murmurs. And still, it went viral. Within hours, regional news picked it up. They ran the clip on repeat, paired with captions that read, Judge orders self-investigation after evidence of corruption uncovered, and community member uncovers illegal evictions in small Mississippi town. Jasmine's name wasn't even mentioned at first. No one knew it yet. The story wasn't about her. It was about the system she'd broken open with nothing more than a binder, a calm voice, and an unrelenting sense of justice. But by midday, people began asking, who was the woman in the blazer? The mystery became part of the magic. They found her name in the court transcript, Jasmine Crockett. No law firm listed, no business card handed out, no press conference, no camera smile, no social media. Just a name, spoken clearly once in front of a judge. A name that had unraveled decades of unchecked power. That evening, every local affiliate had some version of the story. In Pine Bluff, they led with it. Evelyn Turner appeared on screen, standing outside her home, the eviction notice in her hand now torn in half and tucked into a file labeled Case Closed. Her voice was steady, eyes focused, no longer trembling. She spoke into the camera with the calm authority of someone who had already survived the worst thing she would ever face. I thought I didn't matter, she said. I thought the court was just another door that locked behind people like me. But that woman walked in and reminded everyone that justice doesn't have a dress code. It has a spine. The reporter asked her name. Evelyn smiled. Jasmine, she said. That's all I need to know. Elsewhere, threads began to unravel. Viewers watching from nearby towns started to recognize names. Turner Properties, Lark Hill Services, notaries, court clerks, judges. A woman in Greenville called into a radio show and said her mother had been evicted by the same property company after a mysterious rent discrepancy. A school teacher from Yazoo City posted online about how he'd lost his childhood home under a rushed ruling by Judge Warren 2 years prior. The more people spoke, the more the fragments came together, until what had once looked like isolated failures began to form a very clear shape. It wasn't random. It was routine. The state attorney general's office released a brief statement within 48 hours, confirming it had launched an inquiry into Turner Properties and the court rulings linked to Judge Warren. The Judicial Ethics Commission followed with a press release announcing that Warren's case history was under review and that he had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. For the first time in 27 years, his bench sat empty, and still, Jasmine was nowhere to be found. News vans returned to the courthouse, this time circling the building like sharks, hoping she might walk out again. Some camped outside the small legal aid clinic on the edge of town. Others visited the house where she'd once lived as a child, only to be told by neighbors that the family had moved long ago. She had left no footprint, no firm website, no book deal waiting in the wings. And as each reporter reached a dead end, a different story began to take root. That maybe Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to be found at all. Maybe she had only come to finish something. Still, her name echoed. People began whispering it in places where silence used to reign. In waiting rooms outside family court, in whispered conversations at grocery store checkouts, in whispered stories between tenants at apartment complexes who had once believed their evictions were isolated failures. Jasmine wasn't just a name. She had become a permission slip, a signal, a question people asked themselves when staring down the face of injustice. What would she have done here? Back in Pine Bluff, Evelyn Turner's life transformed, not with fanfare, but with quiet consequence. The sheriff's department officially removed the eviction order from her file. A county mediator contacted her to begin restitution negotiations. But the biggest change came when one evening she found two women waiting outside her door. Strangers. They carried folders, worn paper, familiar fear. "Someone told us what happened," one of them said, her voice nervous but filled with hope. "We were wondering if you might help us understand how you fought back." Evelyn looked at them for a long moment. Then she opened the door. She started small. She showed them how to read the fine print, how to demand a certified copy of the eviction order, how to search a notary's license status online. She even pulled out Jasmine's binder, the same one she had left behind with Evelyn the day she walked away. Inside were tab sections, printed statutes, sticky notes with hand-scribbled case names and cross-references. But it was the handwritten note taped inside the cover that Evelyn read most often. "You don't need to be a lawyer to demand justice. You just need to refuse to disappear." In the weeks that followed, others came. A man from Greenville, a mother from Jackson, a college student from Memphis who drove 3 hours just to sit and take notes. They came with questions, with stories, with trembling hands, and left with tools. Evelyn wasn't Jasmine. She didn't want to be. But she had become something else, a keeper of the fire Jasmine lit. And Pine Bluff changed, not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. Tenants began requesting paper trails. Young people showed up at city council meetings. A group of high school students started a civic action club named Section 58 after the housing statute Jasmine cited in court. One of them, 16-year-old Andre Lewis, read every case Jasmine ever mentioned and stood in front of his school board to demand that eviction literacy be taught in their life skills class. All of it sparked by one woman who said almost nothing and did everything. They never found Jasmine. Some claimed to spot her once or twice, leaving a courthouse in Georgia, sitting alone at a coffee shop in Baton Rouge, helping a grandmother in New Orleans fill out a disability claim form. But those sightings were always fleeting, unconfirmed, like wind moving through cracks in a wall. And yet, her absence was louder than most people's presence. She didn't need to return. Her work had stayed behind, in homes that were no longer emptied by greed, in courtrooms that dared not rush their rulings, in the quiet moments when someone who had been stepped on too many times stood up and didn't apologize for doing so. And every now and then, someone would ask, "Where do you think she is now?" The answer always came the same way, a shrug, a smile, and a whisper, "Wherever she's needed next." Months had passed since the day Jasmine Crockett walked out of the courthouse and into the light, her name still echoing long after her footsteps disappeared. The story didn't fade. Instead, it spread like a slow, steady fire, not the kind that raged and burned everything in its path, but the kind that stayed warm under the surface, waiting. Community boards that once held only notices for yard sales and church potlucks now carried hand-printed flyers. The messages were handwritten, some typed, others barely legible through fading ink and photocopy blur. But the message was clear: know your rights. Are you facing eviction? Have you ever been told you owed rent you already paid? Turner Properties, Lark Hill Services. If you recognize these names, you're not alone. No names were signed at the bottom, but they didn't need to be. Everyone knew who had lit the first match. In Pine Bluff, the town once dominated by silent fear, the energy shifted. Not all at once, but slowly, as neighbors began speaking to one another about things they had once whispered only to their ceiling in the dark. Evelyn Turner, once just another statistic in the system, now found herself opening her door every other day to someone new, a woman from 2 streets over who'd been told her rent check never cleared, a man who had been evicted last year and wanted to know if his notice had been legal, a teenager who didn't even understand what a lease agreement was, but wanted to learn so no one could trick my mom again. Evelyn had kept Jasmine's binder. At first it sat on her kitchen table like a relic. Then she began opening it every night, reading it, highlighting, making notes in the margins, just like Jasmine had. She created her own tabs, color-coded the statutes, learned what a motion to compel meant, what a bad faith eviction looked like. Then one evening she brought it to the local community center and placed it on the table in front of a dozen folding chairs. "Tonight," she said, voice clear and strong, "we talk about power and how we've been told we never had any." That was the first meeting. By the third, they had to move to the old library building. And it wasn't just Pine Bluff. All across the state, people were waking up, not because Jasmine told them to, but because her silence had dared them to speak. Jackson, Clarksdale, Greenville. Small towns that had always felt invisible were now connected by a network of people passing scanned documents, legal guides, and court transcripts from phones, printers, and gas station fax machines. They weren't lawyers. Most had never even been in a courtroom except as defendants. But they were learning. Fast. Some called themselves the 58s, after the housing code Jasmine had cited. Others simply used her initials. JC. At a church basement in Yazoo City, a group of teenage girls hosted a workshop on how to read your lease. They had pulled materials straight from Jasmine's binder, rewritten in simpler terms, with examples from their own neighborhoods. At a strip mall in Macomb, a group of retired veterans started a hotline where tenants could call to ask if their eviction looked suspicious. In Biloxi, a single mother printed 500 flyers and went door to door through her apartment complex, handing out printouts of notary license lookups. No one asked permission. No one waited for an invitation. That was Jasmine's greatest lesson. The system only worked against them when they waited for it to give them something. So they took it instead. Meanwhile, news continued to break. The investigation into Judge Warren revealed more than anyone expected. Sealed court records, missing audio recordings, and a pattern of disproportionate rulings favoring the same cluster of landlords. A state-level audit found that over 200 eviction cases had been handled in violation of procedural standards. 45 of those cases were reversed. Some tenants were compensated, others were still fighting. But this time, they weren't fighting alone. And Daniel Green, the landlord who had started it all, he was indicted on 6 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of falsifying legal documents, and 1 count of conspiracy to defraud a state court. His empire crumbled quietly. The properties were sold, rebranded, but no new sign could hide what had happened. The people remembered. Jasmine never returned, not to Pine Bluff, not to the press, not to the courtroom she cracked wide open. She left no interviews, no victory tour, no social media posts with a raised fist and a hashtag. Her name became something different now. Not a brand, not a figurehead, a principle. One evening outside the community center, Evelyn sat across from a young woman who'd driven 2 hours to ask a simple question. "Why do you do this?" Evelyn smiled, her fingers brushing over the binder's worn edge. "Because someone did it for me when no one else would," she said. "She didn't stay. She didn't want credit. But she made sure I had what I needed to stand up. Now it's my turn to pass that on." The woman asked her, what was her name? Evelyn smiled again, this time slower. "Jasmine." "Where is she now?" Evelyn looked toward the horizon. "I don't know," she said. But I bet someone else is asking that same question in some other town, about to lose their home, about to give up. And maybe, just maybe, Jasmine's walking in their direction. By the 6-month mark, Pine Bluff held its first ever tenant protection forum, attended by over 200 residents. Legal experts volunteered time. Law students drove in from Baton Rouge and Oxford. A retired judge from Tennessee offered to help vet questionable evictions for free. No one was paid. No one asked for thanks. And at the center of every conversation, every clipboard, every form passed around. Jasmine's name was never printed, but everyone spoke like she was still in the room. A mural appeared on the side of the old courthouse weeks later. It showed a woman in profile, face turned slightly, blazer flapping in the wind, her hand holding a binder, her body walking forward into gold. It didn't have her name, just words in bold paint beneath her feet. She didn't ask for power. She took it back, and from there, passed it on. Because some people change laws, others change people, and when the system forgets who it's meant to serve, sometimes it only takes one person to walk in, quietly, and remind it. But when the movement spread and the system finally started shaking, a deeper truth emerged, one that wasn't written in any legal file, printed on a court docket, or chanted in protest. It was written in the eyes of every person Jasmine had fought for, the single mother with eviction papers in her purse, the retired veteran who never understood why his hearing lasted only 90 seconds, the teen who watched his family be pushed out of their apartment because of a technicality they couldn't pronounce. These people weren't just victims, they were targeted, not because of what they had done, but because of what they lacked: time, money, paperwork, power. In every cracked sidewalk, in every courthouse bench, in every ink-smudged document, a quiet war was being fought, one that no one televised, until Jasmine stepped into it and reminded everyone that justice is only blind when those in power choose to look away. The real injustice wasn't just in the forged signatures or the corrupt judge. It was in how easy it had become to normalize losing. The system didn't shout, "You don't matter." It whispered it in every unanswered phone call, every denied appeal, every gavel dropped without even asking the defendant to stand. That was the design. And Jasmine knew it, because she had been on the receiving end of that silence. And once you survive it, you can never forget its sound. So she came back, not to shout, not to storm the building, but to expose it one layer at a time, with evidence, with clarity, with unshakable truth. And through her fight, the real lesson came into view. It wasn't that heroes wear suits or stand behind podiums. It wasn't that justice always wins if you try hard enough. It was that the line between dignity and destruction is paper thin. And for the most vulnerable, it takes only a missed envelope or a skipped form to fall straight through the cracks. Evelyn Turner didn't face a villain with a gun. She faced a printed letter, a smile from a landlord, a stamp on a form. And that's what made it more terrifying, because that's how oppression works in modern times. Quiet, lawful, disguised as order. But Jasmine showed the world that the most dangerous weapon in a corrupt system is someone who knows the rules better than the people abusing them. Her journey wasn't about revenge or reputation. It was about interruption, interrupting the cycle where the poor are too tired to fight, where the truth is too buried to matter, where courtrooms become machines instead of arbiters of fairness. She didn't wait for the law to come save Evelyn. She became the law's reminder of why it exists in the first place. And in doing so, she forced everyone watching, judge, attorney, clerk, neighbor, to ask themselves a question they hadn't faced in years. What if the person we're ignoring is right? The human lesson in Jasmine's story is brutal in its honesty. That justice is not self-correcting. It takes effort. It takes resistance. It takes someone willing to be uncomfortable, unwelcome, and unwavering. Jasmine could have walked away. She could have sent an email, written a letter, filed a quiet complaint. But she walked in herself, binder in hand, truth in her mouth, and history behind her, because she knew that nothing changes unless someone makes it personal. And the story she left behind wasn't just about saving Evelyn's home. It was about reminding people they're not crazy for feeling like the system is rigged. They're not weak for struggling to survive it. And they're not alone if they've ever looked around and thought, this can't be justice. The binder Jasmine carried became more than a tool. It became a torch, a symbol that knowledge, when weaponized in the right hands, can be more dangerous to corruption than any protest ever could be. And the people she empowered didn't just learn the law. They learned to see themselves as worthy of it. That's the part no one talks about. How much strength it takes to believe you deserve protection when everything in your world has taught you to expect punishment. In every great fight for justice, there comes a moment when someone stops asking for help and starts demanding fairness. That's what Jasmine taught. She didn't give Evelyn a miracle. She gave her a megaphone. She didn't overthrow a courtroom. She restored its purpose. And in doing so, she left behind a blueprint, not for rebellion, but for reckoning. For every mother, veteran, student, worker, tenant, citizen who's ever been told they were too late, too poor, too invisible. Jasmine's message was simple. You don't need permission to be right. You just need to be ready when they finally listen. And even though she vanished before the cameras came, her legacy remained. Not in headlines, but in habits. In people who now question their lease terms. In judges who now double-check their own rulings. In clerks who stop and ask, has this person been heard? That's the lesson. That true justice isn't about one dramatic victory. It's about shifting the balance back where it belongs, piece by piece, voice by voice. And the most powerful force in that fight is a person who remembers what it feels like to be forgotten and swears they'll never let it happen again. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.